I'm Spencer Bailey. This is Time Sensitive. Hey everyone, on this week's episode, which marks the end of Season 7, we'll be back with Season 8 in the fall. I speak with the Miami-born, Brooklyn-based artist José Parlá. Through his abstract works, José explores memory, gesture, layering, movement, dance, hip-hop culture, codes, mapping, mark-making, and so much else. Language is central to his work, as is translation, and as much as his work and writing is about calligraphy and script, it's also almost a form of hieroglyphics. There's really a sense that, while decidedly of the 20th and 21st centuries, his paintings also extend in meaning and method back to ancient wall writings and cave drawings. On the episode, José talks about his recent harrowing experience with COVID-19, a severe case that required him to be hospitalized, intubated, and put into a medically induced coma for 3 months, during which he suffered a stroke and brain bleeding. His doctors didn't expect him to survive. We also get into the impacts of the path-breaking legacy of his Cuban aviator grandfather, his activism with the collective Wide Awakes, and how his large-scale murals at places including the Brooklyn Academy of Music, Barclays Center, and One World Trade connect to his early days in the late 80s and early 90s of painting burners or elaborate wall works with aerosol in Miami and Atlanta. Before we get into the episode, I'd first like to thank our Season 7 presenting sponsor, the Maison Van Cleef and Arpels, which this year is working with the American Museum of Natural History in New York to present the exhibition Garden of Green, Exquisite Jewelry by Van Cleef and Arpels at the museum's Mignone Hall of Gems and Minerals. On view through January 2024, Garden of Green showcases 44 creations from the French high jewelry house, 32 of which are on view in the U.S. for the first time. Creating a lush garden of jewelry, this impressive array of precious and ornamental green stones forms a dazzling journey that celebrates the beauty of gardens and nature. One area of the exhibition space highlights a diversity of green stones. Another concentrates on particular materials such as jade, chrysoprase, and malachite. And a third displays a selection of majestic creations set with emeralds. You can learn more at www.amnh.org/exhibitions. That's www.amnh.org/exhibitions. And now, here's my conversation with José. José, welcome to Time Sensitive.
Hey, thank you, Spencer. Really nice to be here. Thank you.
So you just turned 50.
That's right.
Let's start there. How are you thinking about your 50 years on Earth?
It's really interesting. Great question to start this conversation with. Last year, I survived a near-death experience from COVID-19 and pneumonia. So my 50th has been a major celebration of life, of breathing, of healing, literally physical healing, and also mental. I've gone through a lot in my life, but that period, seeing so much decay around me in society, both politically and just seeing people's health deteriorate at such a level. I live in front of the Brooklyn Hospital. So before I got sick, I did experience seeing truckloads of folks that did not make it at the same time that there were protests down DeKalb Avenue of hundreds and hundreds of people at a time and protesting the police murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery. And so all this vivid, very vital situations were happening. And then soon after, I end up in the same hospital. So now, my 50th, I'm incredibly grateful, beyond what I can put into words, honestly. But I see things with a simplified way. I'm just really, concentrating on my health and those good people around me and collaborating with people who think alike so that we can plant the seeds, however small, we start to make the world a better place, because we're in real dire straits right now in the planet. But 50 is significant for me because it's also the 50th anniversary of the birth of hip hop culture. And we could kind of say that that's just a number that is attached to that because hip hop could literally be ancient, comes from the motherland of Africa and came through the Caribbean and made its way back up to the Bronx. And like that, I feel a part of it. I grew up within that community. It's given me so much love, and I've been a part of something that's, I think, historical. And to be a visual artist in that canon, but not only just be pigeonholed within it, but sort of
Exist without it.
Exist without it, within it, travel internationally and make it to 50. Well, I just sort of downloaded a lot for you there, but this is what I'm thinking. I'm thinking a lot of things right now.
I actually recently spoke with Jelani Cobb on this podcast about 50 years of hip hop. And it's just amazing to think of hip hop as this sort of act of language and of translation. And that's so central to your work.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that you'll hear from a lot of artists that come out of hip hop, whether it's visual art or music, is that we will say that hip hop culture saved us. And we say that with the violence of that structure of society in mind. Like, we came from places that were very dangerous, and that the arts sort of incubated us and put us in touch directly with other artists who thought alike, who thought outside of the violence of the drugs and guns and, just general street craziness. And so it focused us on a path that was creative. And so from within that context, the art that comes out of it is political. The art that comes out of it is thoughtful from the perspective that we are surviving constant madness. Like by the age of 15, I got shot. A lot of people don't know that about myself, my life. And so I've survived several things that through the art, I was able to gain strength and gain community because there were other people like me that were there for me, besides my family, of course. And mainly my brother, who's also an artist. Ray and I have experienced everything together since we were kids. So hip hop is a large context. That's not just what people think like hip hop is, like hip hop music or rap. We have the elements of it that include all of the societal, element. It's sociological from the perspective of living it and translating it for the masses, because we were once underground. Now it's above ground. Now it's pretty much, you see it in everything now. But we come from the days where it wasn't on the radio. It wasn't on television at all. And we were still doing it for the love.
Do you think, in a way, this hip hop culture survival mechanism, let's call it, helped you with your COVID situation?
I think so. I think 100%. I think that fighting spirit is in me. But of course, when you're, in a coma and you're in that distressed situation, it's a subconscious element that's taken over. But that being said, in the dreams of the time that I was in the coma, I was constantly fighting for my life. There was a kidnapping. In my dreams, I was a hotel owner, and I was worried for people having a decent stay, and was their room okay, and did they like their food? And I was really concerned for, the welfare of people staying at my hotels in these dreams. I had hotels in Cuba and Hong Kong, and, I survived a tsunami in Tokyo. All these things were happening in my subconscious, other dimensional life. And so when I came back to reality, I was confused for a while as to whether those dreams were real or not. And so that was pure survival right there.
Yeah, it sounds almost psychedelic.
Yeah. Well, you could probably imagine that some of the experimental drugs that were being used on people to survive COVID had an effect also on the dreams and hallucinations. That's very possible. I've talked to the doctors about it. And so that's another element there.
How are you thinking about this liminal space you were in, this almost between life and death situation, and the in-between time of the before and the after.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I think of liminal space as something that I've already been in for most of my life. Not just this experience of being in a coma because of COVID. I've been in a liminal space just walking around in cities, experiencing jet lag, trying to translate what I see on walls and the architecture around me in design that you see for the very first time as a young person, and asking yourself, wow, what is this? And how do I translate that and bring that into my work? I feel like I've experienced that euphoric mind space for a very long time. So the coma is, I think, something different than just a liminal space that I was accustomed to. It felt like another dimension because when I woke up, it all registered as my real life memories. So slowly, the psychologist at the hospital worked with me to get me out of believing that I was a hotel owner, that I had offices in Havana and Hong Kong. And like, I really believed all these things. And so that was different for me than just liminal or psychological. It was real. It was so real that I was believing I was still deboarding an airplane while I was in the hospital, and that I had come from this very long flight from Australia. And in the Ciclo's book, Blooms of Mold, I wrote an essay titled The Longest Flight, where I tried my very best to recall all the memories and jump in between the two realities to describe for readers the feeling of being in this other state.
I have to bring up right now the fact that your grandfather was a pilot, because we're talking about flight, and this is just it's too strange. José Parlá, who was this incredible man, Cuba's first pilot, who flew without a compass to guide him from Key West, Florida to El Marial, Cuba on May 19, 1912.
1912.
He also flew over Niagara Falls in September 1916. How do you think about this connection here? I mean, it's almost like too good. And this idea of flight in your life, your work, and this dream state.
Yeah. Growing up, I never got to meet my grandfather. Agustín Parlá has been incredibly significant to my brother and I, growing up seeing photographs of him in his airplane. He made his airplane upstate New York in a place called Hammondsport, New York, with the Curtis Aviation School. And they made the plane out of sugarcane. So it's bamboo structure and canvas with a Curtis motor. And they then took that plane to Florida to fly from Key West to Mariel and to Havana, because he broke records flying over 110 miles over sea with just a compass. And that story was one that always inspired me so much as a person and as an artist, because I also know the backstory of the political side of what he went through as a person in those days. His family was able to send him to flight school because his parents, my great grandparents, fought for Cuba's independence, and they were very close friends with José Martí, who was the Cuban apostle who wrote the very well-known poems and who was the leader of the independence movement to liberate Cuba from colonial Spain. And so we've always had this anti-colonialist thread in our life woven into the independence of Cuba's struggle for freedom. So that being said, it's just this massive inspiration to see his struggle to become a pilot, because he was also the youngest of all the people who were going to become pilots, and he became the first one at the age of 18, which is incredibly young to be a pilot and have that fortitude or have that, maturity to know, like, this is what I want to do. And so you could go a little bit further in. You could imagine Cuba being one of the first countries to have air to fly was because they wanted to join in the allegiance with World War One, and countries around the world wanted to have pilots so that they can literally drop bombs, and it was a military move. So he then became a military man and started Cuba's Air Force, 1913 and on. So a lot of things really were part of his personality that was inspirational to me and my family of survival, because as you become familiar with Cuba's history, Cuba has always struggled with freedom. From one president to the next, there were military coups d'etats and there was dictatorship after dictatorship, and we're still in it. I mean, Cuba's still a dictatorship. And so not to drift too much from that, the fact that there's a connection to my dream state, to being on a long flight, I've also questioned a lot. And I feel a connection, to my family in that way and to my grandfather, Agustín Parlá.
Tell me a bit about your recovery process. I understand it required a lot of physical therapy, and you created this several incredible bodies of work, one of which was phosphine.
Yeah.
Tell me a bit about that.
Sure. So, coming out of the coma, I could barely, I couldn't eat. I had to learn how to swallow. You forget how to use the muscles of your vocal cords and your throat to just eat. And so there was a training process for that with ice cubes and all kinds of different mechanical ideas of how to learn to just swallow again. I had to gain weight because I had lost over 60 pounds. So I couldn't stand on my own, and I had to learn how to stand and take the first step and get strong again that way. So I spent an additional 2 months after the first 3 months in a coma in the recovery ward with physical therapists, getting me back my mechanics of movement. And eventually when I could eat again, just gaining weight and gaining muscle. One of the most important things that happened was that my brother, who was very conscious of me being able to paint again, was in working with one of the doctors who, her father was a painter. So she was very familiar with painting and materials. And they agreed that I should have my watercolors and paper in my hospital room so I could start dabbling again into who I am as a person. Because when I almost died at one point, they thought that I might, if survive, might be paralyzed and never paint again. So they thought it was really important to get me painting again. And my brother covered the hospital walls with paper, and I was in there drawing and writing and doing all these small watercolors, which led to the first series of these landscapes that are now at the Brooklyn Museum for a project called Ciclos, Blooms of Mold. That led to several other series, Polarities, which showed in Detroit at Library Street Collective, Breathing, which showed at the Ghana Art Center in Seoul in South Korea, and now most recently Phosphine, which will open in London in October. Phosphine is something we all experience when we close our eyes after having looked at bright light. You see all these spots and all these colors sort of floating within your mind space and your eyelids. And if you put pressure in your eyelids, those colors will change. And I use this as a language to communicate something that we all experience, no matter who we are. And I use it as a point of departure of where abstraction could start to form all kinds of ideas, no matter what you do in life. And I think abstraction is a very powerful tool to get us thinking outside the normal confines of what we think reality is. So no matter what you do in life, whether you're a doctor or an architect or a dancer or, any practitioner that you do, abstraction can help us think outside the box. And that was what phosphine is for me. It could be looked at as a political mechanism to get us through these very hard times that we're all experiencing together. And so that's where I'm at right now. And that'll be the 5th series since I recovered And I hope after that, what will come will be something completely new.
Was painting a way of you coming back to reality? Like, did that help you realize, oh, I'm an artist?
This is who I am.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, a physical therapist asked me constantly, what's your goal today? What's your goal for your physical structure, but also mentally? I kept thinking, I don't want to forget who I am, because when you're in a coma, you forget so much. You forget names, you forget people. A lot of memory is just gone. One of the things that helped me a lot was painting. And then coming back to the studio, my brother Ray had laid out tables with hundreds of photographs of our life as kids, teenagers, recent works, photos in the studio. And when I saw all these pictures, I would just start crying because I didn't remember the person I was. I was basically destroyed. Now, as you hear me speaking, I have this raspy voice. This is because of the scarification in my vocal cords and my lungs and limited breathing that I have since COVID. But I'm much better today than I was last year. Last year, I would have to gasp for deep breaths just to say a few sentences. So I've gotten a lot better. But that period when I was seeing these photographs and starting to paint again, I was tremendously weak. My lungs were destroyed. I was healing my mind, my memory, and my lungs and the physical strength, because when you don't get enough oxygen, you also are just exhausted mentally and you don't have room for memory. You're just in the moment. And so I'd be talking with someone, having a conversation, and I would forget the next thing I wanted to say because I wasn't getting the proper oxygen. So there was all these challenges.
Well, it's so interesting to hear that about memory, because that's such like a central component of your work is the role of memory, and almost this layering process you go through is about memory.
Yes.
Did you make that connection in a way, like this idea that your memory had almost been wiped and now you're layering it back together just like your paintings?
Yeah, I'm putting it all back together again. That's what it felt like exactly. Without sounding like, I don't know, whimsical. Really, what I was feeling with every stroke was a deep sense of emotion, somehow very connected spiritually to the thought of, what will I do now with the breath I have left, with these questions of how much longer do I have to live? You know, knowing that I was close to 50 now, and will I live another 10 years, 20? Like, that was a very present question for me. And what will I do? Why did I survive? Of so many millions of people who died from COVID, why am I still here? So putting it all together again felt like a responsibility, felt like I'm here for a reason. The search for purpose is important to me. You know, the year previous to becoming sick with COVID, I was very active in New York City with the group of Wide Awakes and Four Freedoms, with my dear friend Hank Willis Thomas and JR and so many other artists, my brother included, and Wildcat Ebony Brown. We were organizing a way to bring joy to protests because it was a very depressing time for so many people. So we thought about musical ways to gather people at parks and march from uptown in Harlem to the Justice Department and make it joyful for people to join in and dance and also protest the brutality of the political spectrum, but also find a way to get people to remember that we have to bring happiness to each other because there are so many oppressive forces around us. So waking up and coming back to health from COVID, I kept thinking about all of that music that we created and the art we created.
Yeah.
I did a show called The Awakening in Japan, and we started a Wide Awakes chapter in Tokyo, which is very active now in local Japanese politics, inspired by what we did here in New York. So all of these things we see as very positive seeds that were planted. Because you start thinking, wow, this is daunting. How can I make any difference? And so we can, just with little things. the search for purpose continues because, it's not like you wake up from this coma and you're like, I figured it out. This is what I'm going to do. I think just doing various projects, writing about the art, not just painting, but writing about it constantly. These conversations, hopefully this conversation that you and I are having will spark thoughts in other creatives that will lead them to have their purpose, be significant in their own way. And all of this is just part of how important it is to spread that love. This is love. Us having this conversation is creating. And it's a currency. It's a currency much more powerful than actual money.
I can only imagine that even the term wide awakes has such new potency to it compared to even how you were looking at it prior to.
Yeah.
In the Times, Max Lakin wrote about Polarities, the Detroit Library Street Collective series you painted, that there's a sense of all the anger and frustration coursing through the paint, an accelerative thrust that feels impatient, as if time is running out. This being a podcast about time, I wanted to read that quote, but also see, how do you view that sense of urgency in the paintings you've been making?
Well, when Max wrote those words, I felt like he really captured it, captured the work, captured me. And, often writers, as an artist, you think, wow, they missed all this. We had this great conversation and they missed it. He didn't miss it. He got it because I did have a tremendous sense of urgency to heal through the work, to show that in the work, that others could heal by looking at the work. Each work had this point of departure of energy, just spewing out of sections from the paintings where you see light almost coming through. And I kept imagining that as like light flowing through my veins and giving me strength to paint. I remember during Polarities, one of the major paintings in that show, I hit a pivotal point where I jumped for the first time to get these strokes that are really long in the painting. And it was so automatic for me to jump that I didn't think my body couldn't sustain landing. So I just fell straight to the ground. I hit the floor with all my weight, but I was laughing from the joy that I had jumped because I hadn't been able to do it for months before that. So I'm there on the floor. My brother comes to see me, like laying on the floor, like, are you okay? He was worried for me. And he's like, why are you laughing? He helped me get back up. I'm out of breath. I picked up the paint and I just kept on painting. And so all of that energy in Polarities was really translating the polarization that we were experiencing all over the world politically. Not to mention going back to the very first period that Donald Trump gets into office to the healing coming out of COVID. I'm blaming everything on Donald Trump. Like, it's just, I can't not think of an attitude in the world, in the political spectrum that's more polarizing than people like that, politicians like that divide us. And so these paintings were both about the political spectrum, but also my health coming back and the urgency of proving to myself that I can live strong again, but very mindful of the situation. Something that I grew up with, for example, being a Cuban person, you're a political person because your country's been constantly in political struggle. You grow up being very aware of the theories of communism and capitalism and the structure of democracy versus a place that has no democracy, right? So Detroit for me, and the city of Detroit is one that is known to have been one of the main centers of the industrialized revolution and of, the creation of the automobile and the mechanics of building huge industry. One of the first places to have roads. Havana itself was very wealthy at that time and was one of the major proponents of buying cars. And so there was like this major communication between the two cities. Havana was very wealthy because of the sugar industry. So you had all these incredible architecture from the point of colonial architecture to modernism. So Havana and Detroit both have a strong, deep culture of modernist architecture, and you see it in both cities. Both cities, one capitalist, one communist, are completely decayed. Now Detroit's coming back, a major comeback. There's wonderful things happening, and I love that the arts are a massive proponent of a city coming back. However, Havana's deteriorating both politically and physically. And so that polarization, I used both cities as a way to have that conversation, and the colors that you see in deterioration, because paint chips at a certain way and mold displays color in a certain way. That was also very experimental for me to bring that into the painting. Both cities had that. And so there's a lot going on when I'm thinking of what polarities means to me in the world right now.
Hey everyone, taking a quick break here to tell you a little bit about our Season 7 presenting sponsor, the Maison Van Cleef and Arpels, which this year is working with the American Museum of Natural History in New York to present the exhibition Garden of Green, exquisite jewelry by Van Cleef and Arpels at the museum's Mignone Hall of Gems and Minerals. On view through January 2024, Garden of Green showcases 44 creations from the French high jewelry house, 32 of which are on view in the U.S. for the first time. Creating a lush garden of jewelry, this impressive array of precious and ornamental green stones forms a dazzling journey that celebrates the beauty of gardens and nature. To learn more, visit www.amnh.org/exhibitions. That's www.amnh.org/exhibitions. And now, back to the episode. And weeks before the pandemic and New York stay-at-home order in March 2020, you had a show open at the Bronx Museum of Art. Tell me about that experience and also what it was like for you to have that happen, just a year before your life-altering case of COVID.
Well, there's a lot of interesting things that happened, like coming full circle to be able to do a show in the Bronx. For me, it was really important to pay homage to the Bronx and its significance, again, in hip-hop culture.
And where you had first moved when you came to New York.
And that's where I lived when I first came here, right? So for me, it was a huge honor. And I kept thinking about a song that was really instrumental in my life as a young kid called It's Yours by Tila Rock, where in the lyrics of the song, he's encouraging the listener to take ownership of culture, that this belongs to you, like it's yours. You've got the power to do it. So don't depend on others. It's yours. And for me, I kept thinking about the community in the Bronx and what is a museum, and how a lot of young people feel like maybe not so invited by museums. Like there's this like high and low separation in the art world. So I called it It's Yours, not only an homage to hip hop culture and to that song, but it was a message to the young people like, this belongs to you. Come in. It's yours. The paintings were very much about a lot of the political history of the neighborhoods of the Bronx. Like we talked about redlining. For people who are not familiar with redlining was political decisions made to separate Black and brown neighborhoods from not being able to participate in ownership of property. Insurance companies would not insure these people. So it separated wealthier people from people of lower income. And therefore, there was a racist structure to the way neighborhoods, not only in the Bronx, but in major cities around the country in the United States, were divided. So there was a lot of significance in that exhibition. We collaborated with Snøhetta to design the exhibition and the way that we would display some of the earliest books, my sketchbooks, in their vitrines. And we thought it would be really interesting to have seats. So Snøhetta designed these moving seats that could also be brought together. So you could, as a group, sit together. So there was all these symbols within the design of the exhibition that was about unity. We collaborated with Ghetto Gastro, and they designed local food from the Bronx for the opening night so that people could, dive into the local taste, because a lot of people from around the world came to the Bronx for the very first time for the show.
I was going to say John Gray was actually episode 2 of Time Sensitive.
Oh, amazing, amazing. So we're in the family here. And then also really importantly, I wanted to bring a really incredible musical set to the opening. So I collaborated with Andres Levin, who's a musical artist based in Cuba. And we brought together a band of more than 16 live musicians. My friend DJ and photographer Stefan Ruiz was on the set playing classic Cuban and hip hop music. And so the opening itself was very much community oriented. It was jam packed, just a little bit over 10 days before the shutdown due to COVID-19. So it was almost unbelievable. A lot of people say it was like the last party of the world before COVID. Just thinking about it, it's almost like a dream. Like, did it really happen? Because the museum was shut down after that for 6 months, didn't open for 6 months after, when, the city started to open up little by little. But that was, I think, the beginning of also Wide Awakes, because we decided, I remember going to Hank Willis Thomas studio, and we decided everything we do from now on is a Wide Awakes event. If you have a show, if you DJ a party, just call it a Wide Awakes event. That way we start to get people together under like an umbrella of unity and solidarity. So that was really important as well.
We can call this a Wide Awakes event.
We could call this a Wide Awakes event. Wide Awakes is an open source system.
You mentioned Snøhetta, and you've worked with Craig Dykers for a long time now, the partner at Snøhetta, and he designed your studio in Brooklyn. Almost coinciding with this milestone of your 50th is the new Far Rockaway Writers Library. Could you talk about that project in particular, but also just your work with Snøhetta more generally, how you think about this intersection of art and architecture?
Amazing, amazing. Well, I guess, so Craig Dykers and I have become dear friends, and I have to go back to how we met. We met we were both invited to speak at Pecha Kucha, which Florian Edinburgh introduced us. I met Florian in Tokyo back in the days. The architect from So Ill. And so there was this really great connection. When I saw Craig speak at Pecha Kucha, I was blown away, particularly by the Alexandrina Library in Egypt that they designed, because of their incorporation of language, of all the world's languages in the facade as a hieroglyphic on the facade of the library. And I was blown away. And I gave a speech after him, and we all got 20 minutes to speak, 1 minute per slide. So you're really just rushing through the conversation. He came up to me afterwards and he said, "Oh man, I love what you had to say." And I said, "Same here, man. I love your work." And he's like, "Come by the office tomorrow. I want to talk about a project." So that started our collaboration. And our first collaboration was a library at the North Carolina State University. It's known as the Hunt Library. And I did a painting there called The Nature of Language. And that started our affair to collaborate on other things. When I mentioned to Craig I had bought this property in downtown Brooklyn, he designed the studio on a napkin over a few beers. And we're just real casual. So we did the studio. Shortly after we did the studio, we were already in the competition for the Far Rockaway Writers Library. That was 7 years ago. Now it's ready to open. We were there last week to go and have a look, and it's unbelievable. It looks like something from another planet landed in Far Rockaway. Far Rockaway has a history of Nobel Prize winners. There's 3 Nobel Prize winners that came out of Far Rockaway. It's also a place that, before Broadway, it was where theaters were in New York. So there's this history of writing and storytelling in Rockaway. Furthermore, a famous writer in the sense of urban style of subway painting named Ramel Z, who was friends with Jean-Michel Basquiat, and he came from Far Rockaway, and Sonic from the BAD crew came from Far Rockaway. All these writers in both the literary sense and the painting sense came from there. So the Writers Library, we chose that name to pay homage to the history of the neighborhood and to uplift the idea of writing and telling stories. And so the facade is covered with my artwork. And the calligraphy, it's like an ocean of calligraphy, waving from thinner to thicker lines with a palette of light oranges to darker oranges that will change because the glass itself, as the sun shifts throughout the day, will change the color of the library. During the winter, the artwork will warm the interior, and during the summer, it will cool the building. So it functions also art that functions environmentally. So we're really stoked, really excited about this project opening very soon.
And you've previously mentioned, speaking of writing, in interviews that you really dislike the terms graffiti and street art. And your work really goes all the way back to cave painting. I think we could think of it more as, wall art. Could you speak to this across time view, this idea of like, let's go from cave painting to your library in Far Rockaway?
Thank you. I'm really glad you brought that up. I understand that people want to use those terms. And what I think is that to call what we do, and here I'm going to quote Phase 2, to call what we do graffiti is to call a comet a meteorite. And so when you look at the span of human existence, language is what we do to document our entire life. And so graffiti literally just means to scratch. And what we do is way deeper than just scratching the surface. We've developed as young people an entire language that was based on a very complicated mechanical lettering style, a code that only a certain few groups of people could understand. And we're communicating with each other in an underground way, and that spread throughout the planet. So it's different than, and the same as cave painting. It's related to the writing on the walls of Pompeii, and throughout history, the need for humanity to make a mark. The difference with what we do as writers in the subway art movement that's been labeled graffiti is that we stylized it in a way full of color, full of code, that is significant of being the voice of the ghetto. Okay. And so to pigeonhole it under the term graffiti or street art is, for me, always felt like it's lazy. And it came from the outside definition. Like people who started writing about it in the newspapers in the 1970s, they weren't living it. They weren't doing it like we were. We were the practitioners. So they were coming from the outside and defining us. And in a way, they defined us wrong. And I believe that we should really define ourselves. And so I always thought about it like when you have like anthropologists, they go and spend a few months in the Amazon, and then they come out, after a few months, and they define a tribe that's been living in the Amazon for thousands of years. The tribe doesn't agree with anything this anthropologist wrote because they've only been there 2 months. So it's the same. Like we're a subculture, we're a tribe, and there are many styles that spun out of it. When you think about what was happening in the movement in the 70s, in the subway system in New York City, you had styles like Futura, who was known Futura 2000 back then. He was the first to paint an entirely abstract subway train. And then you had Lee Quinones, at the time known as Lee. And Lee was doing more significant political paintings that were narrative, like Stop the Bomb and, attacking nuclear politics. And so there was all these different styles that started to grow. There was Scene from the United Artists. He had a very mechanical, but also cartoonish world that he brought to it. Dondi was one of the forefathers of lettering style that from then on, so many different artists were inspired by his style. But the godfather of all of it, one of the godfathers was Phase 2. And he remained underground till the day he died, rest in peace, by doing styles that were illegible to the normal eye. It was art that was incredibly coded. And just like a Jackson Pollock or an abstract Arabic calligraphic piece from 800 years ago, it's not meant to be read the way you read phonetics. You read it with a deeper sense of emotion. And that's abstract art.
Your work is also, beyond being a form of hieroglyphics and mark making, about topography in some ways. I mean, there's a landscape quality to it, but also it's a kind of map. Do you view your work as a navigational tool, as a sort of form of placemaking, literally and metaphorically?
It's a form of non-placemaking because I'm inspired by non-places. Like I always called the work a psychogeographical map because I was interested in the places in cities that, not every person likes to navigate. Like I love alleyways and tunnels and communicating with people that live there, like people who are been labeled homeless. I would speak with them and do my own research and realize a lot of these people are in that living condition because they were veterans of war or they had really difficult times in their life that led them to be there. So in a sense, I'm telling the stories of those people, but also telling the stories of poorer neighborhoods. If you look at my paintings, they carry deep textures of replications of the ideas of walls and the memories of accumulated on those walls, like palimpsests that perhaps tell the story of those accumulated groups of history of people from these places. Like I'm not painting about walls in Madison Avenue. I'm painting the Bronx and I'm painting Hackney in London and I'm painting Nakameguro in Tokyo, neighborhoods that are struggling. That's the landscape that I'm interested in, telling the story of the people who are, let's say, less fortunate. Whatever fortune might mean to others is different, but that's what I'm interested in.
I think it's interesting, you talk about coming out of the underground, and your work really does, on some levels, really hit at what you see in that layering on like the subway when there's these old sort of wheat paste posters that have decayed. And
yeah, you start to see history. If you peel away one layer, you start to see, wow, there was something else there. And it's like the old saying goes, the writing's on the wall. Well, that really literally exists because we're looking at ancient hieroglyphics, cave paintings, Egypt, Pompeii. We look at walls historically to look at the trace of humanity, what we left behind. And if we jump into the future, 1,000 years from now, we're going to still be looking at walls and what has been the ruins of today in the future to try and get clues about what happened. We don't know what's going to happen in 1,000 years, but there'll be clues to explain things. Maybe the clues will be digital. Maybe this very recording will exist in a cloud and someone from the future will be able to pull it and go, wow, Spencer Bailey, José Parlá, we're talking about some wild things on that day, So who knows? Maybe this is the mark making of today, this digital form. And as we become more digital, I think paintings made by hand and those textures become more significant because it's something tangible. It's a different type of documenting. It's not ephemeral if it's taken care of. Like the way we go to a museum to see something from 1,000, 2,000 years ago. We look at it and we're astonished. Wow, that came from Mesopotamia and it's still here at the Met. That's the way I think about art being made today.
Hey everyone, taking another quick break here to let you know about the Slowdown's new membership program. At just $100 a year, or put differently, a little more than $8 a month, it provides access to our slate of new member-only newsletters, in-depth stories, immersive interviews, curated recommendations, and exclusive event invitations. If you haven't already checked it out and want to learn more, or if you'd simply like to support this podcast and all that we do at the Slowdown, go to slowdown.tv/subscribe. That's slowdown.tv/subscribe. And now, back to the episode. I want to go back to your upbringing. You were born in Miami to parents who had fled Cuba. Your father was a traveling salesman. Your mother had studied architecture before the 1959 revolution. And you lived much of your early life in Puerto Rico, then returned to Miami in the 1980s. You were only speaking Spanish at the time.
That's right.
Do you think this is where your interest in language really began? Was that moment of feeling almost an outsider, even though you're back to the place of your birth?
It's interesting. I love that question. Coming to Miami from Puerto Rico and trying to assimilate into the culture, we were called refugees. It was during the time that hundreds of thousands of Cubans were coming by boat. And although we came from Puerto Rico on a plane, we were refugees, and kids that thought themselves superior to us at school, that spoke English, treated us badly. And the only kids who were nice to us were the hip hop kids. So we got into breakdancing and writing rhymes and painting before we even spoke English because those kids spoke Spanish. Often Cuban and Puerto Rican kids, Jamaican kids, Haitian, Black kids from the United States. We formed a little group. And Miami in the 1980s, there was a lot of racism. So groups were divided. Like you had the white kids there and the Black kids there and the Cubans there. The hip hop kids, we looked like a rainbow of kids. The gangs sort of left us alone because they couldn't figure out why we were so united. And it was art that united us. So as we start to learn English, we're also translating an underground culture that the other kids couldn't understand. They were like listening to like pop music and we're listening to records they had no idea even existed, right? So they looked at us like freaks and we looked at them like, who cares? They're boring. So we're translating society as we're learning the language. At the same time, we were custodians of an underground language that came down from New York. We're very aware, like this came from the subway movement. And it was being passed down through sketchbooks and books. Like, let's say, a New York artist. I remember Juice from a crew called TC5. His parents said, you got to go to Florida to stay with your aunt and uncle because you're in too much trouble in New York. Well, he came down to Florida and he just brought the art with him. And others like him and many more would come. And then that art were being passed down to us kids. So we're learning a style from New York and Philadelphia. And now we became custodians. And I use the word custodian specifically because there was a respect to do the art in a specific way that we could then teach it to someone else. So each person became a student and a mentor at the very same time. So collaboration and mentorship was built into the system already. So when eventually in my life, people ask me to mentor students, like in college or at a young arts program, or I'll say, yeah, sure, it's easy because we were built that way. And so I think the interest to translate language was just something that was part of my upbringing from that point of the age of 10 and those pivotal teenage years of surviving Miami. It's 1980s, Miami. Everyone remembers Scarface and Miami Vice, and that was real for us. Like, I remember the FBI raided my junior high school because they found Uzis and Mac-10s and they found cocaine in a junior high school. We're talking 13, 14 years old, and there's serious crime happening and gangs and art, again, saves us because it sends us on a path that, was really shiny for us. It was like, that's nice. Let's go there,
And it was around this time that you got your writing name or nickname given to you by your brother Ray and your friend Jess, which was Ease.
Yeah.
It's a name you kept and adopted as your identity. What's the meaning of Ease? What's the backstory there?
That's interesting. A lot of people know me as Ease still. And it's funny because when someone says, hey, what's up, Ease? I know already it's like person from way back. When someone new uses that name, I kind of feel like, nah, you don't know me that well.
No, man.
Not because, so it's also there's this beautiful feeling to being a writer that I get when I think about so many friends, that helped me become who I am. And some of them have died. They didn't survive. So Ease, that name was given to me by my brother and my friend Jess because I was younger than them. They were really like schooling me, mentoring me into the system. And I was real quiet out of respect because they were older. So it was like, take it with ease, he's always quiet, you know. So I adopted that name because my personality. But shortly after, I became the opposite of tranquility. I'm boisterous, and I was taking over the party and DJing and breakdancing, and but the name stuck. So I use that name still. I mean, it's still my name, but only for some people. But I use it in my first exhibitions, even here in New York, since the age of 10 to about 25, 26 years old. And then later, because my father passed away, he and I are both the same name, José Parlá. I sort of woke up one day and I thought, I want to honor my name, my father's name, and that we're José Parlá. And so I also saw that the underground culture had become so popular. I didn't want to sort of exploit that so-called graffiti entity to gain success. So out of respect, I actually put ease back in the underground and started from scratch. No one knew who José Parlá was. Basically, I was like nobody. And ease was somebody in this other world, and even some in the art world, like at the beginning. So people will still insist on like ease and like using the graffiti context to popularize my projects. I would say no. Out of respect for the culture, I just kept it underground. And so that's the story behind who Ease is and who I am and who is Jose.
Tell me also about your relationship with Ray. You've collaborated with your brother throughout your life. And I think it's worth noting in 2006, you even created a painting titled Brothers Back to Back that really captures this sense of kinship.
Yeah. Brothers Back to Back, that's like a saying we always had, because if you have each other's back, then no one could come from any degree. And so Ray really is an incredible artist. We were known in Miami as Ease and Faz. And so that's kind of a little legend of its own, because we were always people who loved introducing people to each other. We were from South Miami. And at one point we moved to the center, the very center of Miami, where we discovered like an entire world of writers. And we started to meet them. And they were not aware of the Southern Miami writers. We started to invite everybody to meet each other. So we were literally the connectors. So we were very much into collaborating and bringing people together. My brother loved photography. He still does. And he carried a camera everywhere, documenting everything. Then he picked up a Super 8 camera and he started filming stuff. And I was painting, he was filming. And so we just gradually collaborated since we were kids on everything. He also does paintings, and he painted, and we did huge murals with a crew that would eventually become known as the Inkheads. And Ray was pivotal in creating this idea that we were the modern cavemen. So there's this graphic that Ray directed, a caveman with a magic marker. So that became the symbol of our crew, the Inkheads, because we were really rudimentary. While everybody was becoming really, I want to say like fancy in the style of mural making and getting really ingenious with technique and almost drawing paintings like on the level of Michelangelo with spray paint, we were keeping it real underground and using ink to just write our names. So we became the Inkheads. And we were very much like cavemen in the style. We could paint anything, but we chose, again, to be custodians of the original techniques. So we were very much into that. And Ray was instrumental in the thought process for the crew, because he was like, I would say, the intellectual of the crew. He earned another nickname, which is really funny to think about now. We called Ray the Minister of Information Logistics, because he was really good at like researching and gathering ideas and information and then disseminating it to all of us. And then we would execute it and in the art. And we still collaborate. We were in the studio together. We did a show in Paris that was really important for both of us, called Parlá Frère, the brothers Parlá at Colette in Paris. And we've collaborated on numerous projects throughout the years.
I wanted to bring up Hurricane Andrew, 1992. It proved to be this pivotal moment in your life and career. You'd gone off to attend Savannah College of Art and Design on a Scholastic Award, but you left early to come back and help your family post Andrew. And the hurricane also destroyed your studio.
That's right. Yeah.
Looking back, how do you view the significance of that hurricane, that moment on your path?
Such a massive moment. A lot of things were going on. I had gotten a scholarship to SCAD, and I was really grateful to be there and studied with some amazing professors. But I had kind of hit a ceiling there because there was an internal problem with some of the professors there. And at the very time that Hurricane Andrew started to destroy Miami, one of my professors at SCAD said, you know, your family needs you. And anyways, you don't need school. You're ready. You're ready, Jose. And I was like, wow, you know. So I went down to Miami. I got a little studio at the South Florida Art Center. This is before the hurricane came, but weeks after I got the studio, the hurricane destroyed Miami, and I found my paintings down the street in pieces. I thought I need to really focus on work, and I needed a studio, and I didn't have one now. It was destroyed. The building was gone. So I went and enrolled at the New World School of the Arts. I walked in one day without an appointment, and I talked to an administrator, and I had a bunch of canvases rolled with me. And I said, can I talk to the dean? Whenever he's available, I'll wait. You know, a few minutes later, a wonderful man by the name of Mel Alexenberg invited me to his office and asked me to show him the canvases. I rolled them out on the floor. And within the hour of a great conversation, he accepted me into the school. I found some financial aid, and I started at New World School of the Arts. The first project that he did, it was a studio painting course, was to make art from the debris of Hurricane Andrew. So right away, we were engaging the hurricane, and parts of paintings that were destroyed, I was bringing them to the class and assembling. Sort of reminded me of like Rauschenberg's assemblage of trash, right? You know, and I was really influenced by Rauschenberg and Cy Twombly at the time, because it was like a language that I could use as a bridge to convince people that looked at the work coming out of the streets as something that was uneducated or self-educated and not fine art. I would use the abstract expressionist and specifically Cy Twombly, because he used writing and poetry so much as a bridge to say, look, there's similarities here. There's ways to communicate. And so that was an important period for me. And then once it was the end of the class, there was this very pivotal moment that happened where Mel Alexenberg asked us to pick a person in the class to collaborate, and that would be our final project. You were not allowed to do it on your own. So I collaborated with a really good friend of mine who was in the class, Ivan Moreno, who was known as Shy One. And we decided to do an illegal rooftop. And we painted this massive mural in downtown Miami illegally. And we mapped it all out, how we got up there, how we crossed the fence, how we climbed on the rooftop, how we had to hide from the security guard. It was all like a kind of spy movie for us to paint a mural. We then brought that as our final work to critique, but it wasn't in the class. We brought the entire class with us on the train to critique our work. And we gave each student and the professor pamphlets of the entire written project so that they could see at one point the mural. And Dr. Mel Alexenberg, he loved it. He thought, wow, this is crazy. No one's ever given me this as a project. He was a spiritual man. He was a rabbi, actually. And he often would pray and to fill in the classroom privately, but we could see him like he was in his own world. He is an incredible man. But he related our calligraphies on that rooftop as a spiritual script. And he connected it to his own Hebrew philosophy of script and tefillin. And that made me think about our work differently, because I start thinking that there's a phenomenon that took place and made young kids literally came out of the worst neighborhoods in the United States and started making art, taking the risk of doing it at night. And it wasn't just egocentric like most people think. We're trying to communicate something bigger than ourselves. And perhaps that was spiritual. Perhaps it was like we collectively are saying we exist, we flourish, and we blossom. Because what we were doing was incredibly colorful. And we were painting these places that were like decayed, full of rust, full of garbage, destroyed buildings, and we were putting beautifully colored artwork. And we were not being paid for it. So it was something grander there than just like the ego of like trying to be famous. And I think he made me see that as a professor. And it brought this new form of thought into the work that I do from that point on.
Jumping forward, let's just basically come to the present. Over the past dozen or so years, your work's really gone large scale from what you were presenting in gallery spaces and back to the early years where you were making murals. You've since gotten these large scale mural commissions, whether at the Brooklyn Academy of Music, the Barclays Center, One World Trade, the University of Texas at Austin. Could you speak about these projects in particular and how scale has served this really kind of profound purpose in your work? I mean, just to touch on it, dance is such an element of this too. You are quite literally taking flight when you make some of these works.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I'm incredibly honored and grateful to have been invited to these projects because, as you can imagine, there are a lot of artists that can scale up their work, but not a lot have the training to do it. And so going back to my early years, I had the training of not only being able to make lines at scale that are larger than the body, but there was a training that I had already been a part of collaborating and working with groups of people. And when you're working on projects like with architects, you're working with a numerous amount of architects, plus the teams from the universities or the World Trade Center or BAM. There's a lot of people you're dealing with. And so being able to work collaborative is also an element that I was comfortable with, working with groups of people. Then there's the technical aspect of being able to work really large. And I love that idea that in public spaces, you have works that are larger than someone, because then you are involved in this artwork. It's panoramic. You're in a large landscape. It's not just you viewing something in a frame and a scale that you would see in a museum or in a gallery. You're now part of it. The visitor is part of it. As an artist, I become part of it too. And you could trace the body movement and that dance within the mural. There were some gestures and lines that I needed to make that required me to jump off a ladder. And it happened so automatically because I work fast and I like speed in the work. And one day I went up the ladder, and without thinking, when I needed to make the next gesture, I jumped off the ladder 12 feet with the line working out just perfectly. And I landed it without falling because at that time I was fit and there was all the years of breakdancing that you know how to deal with gravity a little bit different. And so it just became a technique. And so I started doing that as a way to get gestures that don't look normal. They're gestures that are not just the capacity of my height. They were longer, they were taller, and I love doing it and adapting a new form that was specific to me. And so having all those years, being able to translate the years of my early phase as an artist to this new way, for me, it gave me a lot, and it gave a lot to the projects.
So let's circle back and finish at 50. Where do you see your next 50 years going? What excites you or gives you hope for the next 50?
That's a great question. I look now at, again, planting the seeds of what will be the foundation and legacy of my work and the works of my collaborators. I think about the studio as a place that can exist beyond my own lifetime. So now I am planting the seeds of how to protect it and work with the right custodians that will be around when I'm gone. So I've started to think about all the work I've done, not only paintings, but the entire archive of photographs, film, the story of it, and how that can benefit younger artists, research, and how that legacy could survive me, and how the building itself, how my studio could become a learning center. It could provide studio space in the future for artists who don't have space. Hopefully I'll live another 50 years, but I think it's important to start thinking about the significance of the work, the significance of philosophies in the work, both in the political connotations of the work and also the sociological and psychological aspects of what I've talked about in essays for years, protecting those writings, protecting the photographs. And so that's the first step. I think it's important to talk about who we are as people and what our heritage means to each and every individual, and how that heritage is to be translated and protected into something that is grander than the heritage itself, and how we could now start to think about humanity as having more unity and more solidarity, to understand the differences that we all have, how those differences are beautiful, and how that beauty is something to be studied and learned about so that we can just continue to plant seeds for a better world. One of the things that happened this year, which is an incredible honor for me, was that I received a fellowship, the Gordon Parks Fellowship. So that's an upcoming project that I have. And I intend to use that as a platform to spread that message of Gordon Parks, of unity, of how we as humans need to find a better way. And so that's what my work has always been about. But I think there's got to be better ways for me to even think about my own work so that it can be easily translatable for those who need to have understanding of how they can impact the world themselves.
Beautiful. Let's end there. Thanks, Jose.
Thank you so much, Spencer.
Extra thanks to our Season 7 presenting sponsor, the Maison Van Cleef & Arpels. Van Cleef & Arpels' jewelry is characterized by a distinctive blend of poetry and refinement. With its iconic jewelry collections, it is an invitation to a timeless universe of beauty and harmony. You can discover more at vancleefarpels.com. That's VANCLEEFARPELS.com. And thank you for listening. You can find more episodes of Time Sensitive on our website, timesensitive.fm, or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can follow us on Instagram at slowdown.tv. To join the Slowdown's new membership program, which provides access to subscriber-only newsletters, in-depth stories, immersive interviews, curated recommendations, and exclusive event invitations, go to slowdown.tv/subscribe. That's slowdown.tv/subscribe. Our theme music was composed by Billy Martin. This episode was produced by Ramon Broza, Emily Jang, and Johnny Simon.